Pretty rare to hear a journalist talking about inviting a friend onto the stage when he's a politician, but thanks very much. I'll take that as a compliment. ASA President, delegates, and friends. First of all, can I just thank you for the invitation to be here. I am conscious that the Minister for Agriculture is out of the country at the moment. In fact, the Minister of State for Agriculture is as well. And so it's a real honour and a privilege for me to come back to speak to a really well-informed group of people on agriculture, the food industry, and the impact of some of the work that I'm doing on your sector and your industry as you plan for the future. And I have to say, when I left the Department of Agriculture and later on when I joined the Department of Foreign Affairs, I never thought that the policy areas that I would be working on would have such a linkage with farming, farm prices, the agri-food industry, international trade when it comes to food, fertilizers, fuels, and so on. But undoubtedly now, the income and the business model that family farms have to adopt is so influenced by what is happening outside of Ireland, in other parts of the world, in conflict zones, in political meetings in places like Brussels and Washington. And that is going to continue to be the case, not just from a CAP policy perspective, but also from a geopolitical perspective. And I just wanted to talk about some of those things today. I was thinking about what I'd say last night, and I initially thought that people might want to hear about my views on farm practices and agriculture and some of the new technologies and so on. And I thought about that, and I thought about the speakers who would be speaking today, and I think there's very little I could teach anyone in this room on some of those areas. When I think of the list of speakers today, from Frank O'Mara to John Murray to Siobhan Kavanagh, Frank Monaghan, practical farmers in this room who've been speaking today as well, big agri-businesses like Glanbia, and of course what we've just heard from Lawrence Shalhoub. The actual the conversation and the debate and the questions today on farm practices and how we respond to the challenges of building sustainable businesses on our farms, as well as protecting biodiversity and doing what we must do in terms of driving down emissions and making agriculture more sustainable. I think you've got a fantastic lineup of speakers that certainly from the last half hour of discussion that I heard is extremely both informative but also impressive in terms of what agriculture needs to do with the help of government, with the help of policy certainty, and with the broader agri-food industry and different state agencies helping in those efforts. But let me just talk about foreign policy, because it really has been, in the last number of years, this extraordinary conveyor belt of crises that we've had to deal with one after the other, all impacting on the food sector, on pricing, on markets, and on how we plan for the future. Whether you look at COVID, whether you look at conflict in different parts of the world, but in particular, most recently, and continuing in Ukraine, whether you look at the relationship with our closest neighbour in the context of Brexit and the ongoing challenges in terms of the Northern Ireland Protocol, or indeed, whether you look at government policy and indeed EU policy in the area of climate and biodiversity. All of these things require, in order for farms to remain both profitable and sustainable, and preferably both, a change in practice, adaptation, and new ways of doing things and thinking about the challenges that we face. First of all, let me just talk about COVID, because a lot of people that I speak to seem to think about COVID now in the past tense. And there is, of course, the health challenge of COVID that we have tried to respond to as best we could as a government. And of course, the health challenges in our hospitals and in our communities. But there's also been a global trade impact of COVID that we should not ignore. What COVID has done in many countries is fire up a debate around a more protectionist approach towards sourcing. Many of the large multinationals that act globally now actually look at sourcing security as important an issue as price competitiveness. And certainly from a European Union perspective, we were very much exposed in terms of an over-reliance on other parts of the world as regards sourcing essential products during that health catastrophe. And that has triggered in so many boardrooms across the world, including in the food sector, a debate now around how and where we source product, and whether or not the countries and the regions that we source from can be relied upon to be able to deliver the kind of product that consumers will demand in the future. And Ireland needs to think about that very carefully, because we have an extraordinary competitive advantage in this space. Countries, whether they be in Europe or indeed on the other side of the Atlantic or in other parts of the world, can rely on political stability in this country, can rely on economic and conflict stability in Europe and indeed in Ireland. And I think the sourcing of cheap product or cheap food, as the case may be in this sector, is really going to be questioned in the future, not just from a climate perspective and a biodiversity perspective and a labour and human rights perspective, but also from a security of supply perspective. And I think we will see price premiums attached to that kind of supply certainty in supply chains. And we need to think about that as a sector that is effectively a multinational sector out of Ireland in terms of beef and dairy and lamb and many other products that we add value to from those raw materials. In relation to conflict, and in particular Ukraine, February the 24th really has changed so much in terms of geopolitical engagement. We are unfortunately now entering effectively a new Cold War. And the impact of that is going to be across multiple areas. Energy, security in terms of military security, food security, but geopolitical tensions which will result in prolonged application of significant sanctions that I think will create, for a sustained period of time, this is not going to end soon, significant disruption in terms of how supply chains operate, and that is already impacting and has been for the last nearly 8 months on family farm management. The price of fertilizer is rocketing, the price of fuel increasing dramatically, and of course the price of food commodities increasing significantly as well. And so if you're a dairy farmer in the country today, you will have seen significant price increases in terms of inputs, but more than compensated in terms of profitability by dramatic price increases in terms of milk. And different variants of that in beef, in the horticulture sector, and of course in grain as well. And so I think we are now in a period, and we're going to remain in a period for quite some time, I think, of high food prices, but also very high input prices. And depending on the balance you have in terms of the type of farming that you're doing, we are going to need to work through Teagasc and many other organizations to ensure that we are maximizing profit in the new realities that we face, that are going to evolve over time. And I don't think we're going to continue to see price increases like we have over the last 8 months. But even if prices stabilize or reduce slightly, we're still going to be operating in a very, very different business model to what many of you would have been planning for even 10 months ago. And so the impact of effectively taking Russia and Ukraine partially out of global markets in terms of supply chains has been enormous. And if you think about it for a second, between Russia and Ukraine, they make up 24% of global wheat exports, almost 60% of sunflower seed exports, 14% of corn exports globally. and that is what's driving this extraordinary disruption in terms of pricing. In terms of global prices, but we've seen even more dramatic increases here. But sugar up 23-24%, meat up nearly 25%, dairy up well over 40% internationally, cereals up 70%, oils up 140%, and the overall food index up between 60 and 70% in terms of global pricing in the space of 6 months. It's extraordinary disruption for a sector that is normally reasonably predictable in terms of pricing models and planning accordingly. It's almost inappropriate for me to talk about the economic impact of the war in Ukraine without talking about the human suffering there too. I was the first foreign minister actually to visit Kyiv since the war began back in April. And I was in the town on the outskirts of Kyiv, Bucha, which everybody will be familiar with for all the wrong, horrific reasons. It's a town that is sort of a similar distance away from the center of Kiev that maybe City West would be from Dublin. It's a 30-minute drive or so. But just to visualize for a second what's happening on our continent right now. When I was there, I was standing at the back of a church, St. Andrew's Church, that had a mass grave of over 300 people in it. Only 4 of them were soldiers. The rest of them, women, children, young men who had nothing to do with the conflict, but were being effectively intimidated, tortured, slaughtered, raped. In many cases, the bodies burnt to try to hide some of the evidence of that. So when you think about the sort of economic disruption that we're trying to grapple with, plan for, manage, and in some ways take advantage of in terms of new business models that Ireland, I think, has a competitive advantage in responding to, don't forget the human cost of what's happening here. That is why just under 50,000 Ukrainians have come to Ireland to live amongst us and are going to be with us for many, many months to come. But just to reiterate the point of how do we think about, in rooms like this one, responding and carving out competitive advantage for Irish food producers from a pretty dramatic change in terms of how food markets operate. One of the things I think we can do that others can't is we can produce food with significantly less fertilizer use than we have done in the past. We have a grass-based system, which is unlike most other countries in Europe and certainly most other countries in the world. And I think we can create, I hope Frank and others were talking about this earlier, but certainly there is an opportunity to create cost competitive advantage from grass-based systems, particularly around dairy and beef product, over the kind of lot-based systems that are heavily reliant on the intensive production of food through significant inputs on relatively small plots of land. We have a different system that I think, from a cost-based perspective, can, by effectively creating natural fertilizers, whether that's organic or through better grassland management, improved species management, improved use of clover and so on, we can, in my view, respond to that challenge of needing to reduce chemical fertilizers because of the cost of them, but also because of the environmental challenges that we face, which I'll talk about now in a second. Let me just talk about Brexit because it's become very current again. We've been dealing with Brexit since 2016. I feel that almost my entire time as a Minister for Foreign Affairs has been dominated by that one agenda. And it's still there and not going away. And we have a new British Prime Minister now. We have a new Secretary of State in Northern Ireland. We have a new Foreign Secretary. And one of the things that we in Ireland need to try to settle with our closest neighbours in the UK are the uncertainties around the fallout of Brexit as it continues. And I think there is a window to do that. and the agri-food sector is very reliant on us getting that solution, because the alternative is a continued and increased fallout, if you like, of disagreement and standoff. If the British government proceed to pass their protocol legislation through Westminster and make it law, they will effectively collapse the protocol. That will be the result of that. There will be no protocol. And if that happens, it creates enormous uncertainty in terms of how an all-island economy functions in that context. And of course, how the UK and the EU trade with each other. Never mind trade across the Irish Sea, because the EU will be forced into responding to that unilateral action by the UK, which it simply cannot accept. And the UK government know and understand that. And therefore, the linkage between the withdrawal agreement, which includes the protocol, which is a legal obligation under international law in terms of its implementation for the British government, given the commitments that they've made in an international treaty. Those commitments are inextricably linked with the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, which was agreed 12 months after that. And so the Trade and Cooperation Agreement can't function properly without a protocol functioning. Certainly not from an Irish perspective, north and south. And so you cannot solve a disagreement around an international treaty by taking unilateral action that the other side fundamentally doesn't agree with. And that is what the British government are claiming that they will do if they cannot find a way to negotiate a position that both sides can sign up to. What we don't know is whether this is essentially a negotiating tactic to try to create pressure for compromise, or whether it's an absolutist position, which I certainly hope and suspect it isn't. And so the challenge for politics and for people like me to do a job for everybody in this room and for every farmer in the country and everybody who relies on a functioning all-island economy for the agri-food sector is to find common ground. And I think we can do that. I think we need to do it quickly, because if we don't, by the 28th of October, if there is no functioning executive in Northern Ireland, in other words, if the DUP don't agree to appoint a Deputy First Minister, and we have a functioning devolved government in Northern Ireland, well then the new Secretary of State for Northern Ireland is obliged by law to announce the date for new elections in Northern Ireland. And trust me, compromise is never easy when you're in an election cycle. So now is the time. We have a new Prime Minister. She's just appointed a new government. She's going to be given a chance in terms of exerting her authority and leadership within the British government. We also have a window in advance of a new cycle of elections in Northern Ireland that can and should be avoided because nobody wants them. And we should take it between now and the end of October. So just to say, I mean, my initial conversation with the new Secretary of State was very positive. Chris Heaton-Harris is someone who I know quite well. I was in the European Parliament with him. He is a strong supporter of Brexit and all that comes with that. But he's also a pragmatist, from my experience. And I hope that we can build on the good conversation that we had yesterday in the days ahead. The Taoiseach will be speaking to the Prime Minister today, and I hope that they will also start well in terms of this new era, if you like, of relationships between Britain and Ireland, which really needs to turn the tide on the standoffs and the tension that we've seen in recent years linked not only to Brexit, but to other issues in Northern Ireland as well. Until we get back to a relationship of partnership with the UK, we are going to continue to have problems in this space. And from my point of view and from the Irish government's point of view, we made it very clear. There was a significant meeting in Oxford last weekend, and both the Taoiseach and myself made it very clear to the British government, as did Vice President Maroš Šefčovič, who's the negotiator on the EU side, that the door is now open. We want to engage seriously and honestly in settling the issues around the protocol, but we are not going to rewrite the protocol to do that. We think it can be done by applying the maximum flexibility possible to the implementation of that protocol. And effectively what that means is that I think we can look to treating goods that are staying in Northern Ireland, coming from Great Britain, very, very differently to goods that may be travelling on or at risk of travelling on south across the border into the EU and on into other parts of the EU single market. And we can apply a different risk management system on those goods in terms of removing checks, or at least the vast majority of them, which can respond to the core unionist concern, which they have expressed about trying to ensure that the UK's single market is also respected to the greatest extent possible, while also protecting the integrity of the EU single market, which Northern Ireland will be part of. Not an easy thing to do if you look at it from an ideological perspective. But if you look at it from a practical, pragmatic perspective in terms of facilitating trade and managing risk in terms of that trade with the maximum flexibility possible, then I think we can make progress. But look, it's really over to the UK. You know, we have, Šefčovič has published a paper that we accept probably needs to go further, but was a very significant effort at breaking the deadlock. It's really up to the UK and a new Prime Minister and a new team around her to respond to that open and honest and confidential dialogue between London and Brussels with the support of the Irish government. And if we do that, then I think progress can be made, and progress can be made quickly, which it needs to be. The final thing I'd just like to mention is in relation to climate and biodiversity. Just by the way, on the protocol, I mean, I assume you don't need me to talk about why the protocol is so important for our sector. You know, anybody who's working in the dairy sector will know the importance of ensuring that Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland can continue to contribute to the same milk pool. In order for that to happen, Northern Ireland has to be in the single market. If Northern Ireland is outside of the EU single market, there is a huge issue that we don't want to have to deal with, that would be difficult to manage. But it's not just dairy. It's also beef, it's also lamb, and it's also a whole range of other farm materials, inputs, skill sets, stock, and so on, that move seamlessly between north and south in terms of purchasing from marts, purchasing machinery, and a whole range of other things. That all-island agri-economy, if you like, and of course its access into the rest of the UK, we need to protect, and the protocol does protect. And so we need to protect what we've achieved in the protocol, which is significant. You know, it prevents any border infrastructure on the island of Ireland. It keeps Northern Ireland in the EU single market for goods, while respecting the fact that Northern Ireland has left the European Union with the rest of the United Kingdom. I mean, it's an extraordinary achievement of negotiation. But now we've got to make it stick and ensure that it can actually function in practice. And we've also got to accommodate what are legitimate concerns by the unionist community in terms of product coming into Northern Ireland, staying in Northern Ireland from GB. But those products have got to be consistent with the standards and rules and regulations of the EU single market. Otherwise, we're facilitating potentially unfair trade and an undermining of the integrity of products that come from the EU single market. And that's why this is a difficult thing to get agreement on. Just to finally talk about climate, and I know, given the title of the conference this year and the presentation that Lawrence was making when I came in, I suspect that really has been the focus of the conference this year. You know, how do we apply science? Better ways of doing things to ensure that we can respond to the challenge that agriculture has got to respond to. This isn't optional. You know, we have got to find a way to reduce emissions from agriculture by 25% by 2030. Not only do we have a moral obligation to do that, by the way, and there's no bigger supporter of the family farm system that we have in Ireland than me, I can assure you, in government or anywhere else. But no one gets a free ride when it comes to to agriculture or to climate change. And I think that 25% is achievable. And I think we've got to be ambitious together to go after that. We know that the work that Teagasc and others have done can deliver about 17 to 19% or so of that challenge. We know we need to go beyond that, and we need to be investing in and working on the technologies that can allow us to do it. And I believe we can do that not by reducing output, but by becoming much more efficient in terms of how we produce what we produce on our farms today. Because the family farms that I know want to make a profit from the products that they're producing, not being overly reliant on a check in the post from government or from the EU through various different schemes that are really important in terms of changing behaviour and providing income support. But commercial farming is part of the sustainability of farming, from my perspective, in Irish agriculture. You know, a family farm of 100 acres, raising cattle or producing milk is about as sustainable a thing to do, if it's done well, as I can think of. As long as we take on board the science that is there now for us and is continuing to develop. And we do need to, and I know I get this frustration every time I speak to a room of farmers or people who are involved in the food industry. There is a lot of criticism in the general media about farming being the problem in terms of climate change. I reject that. Farming is, in percentage terms, a big contributor to emissions in Ireland. That's true, because we have a very large sector as part of the Irish economy. But it's also the solution. If you're responsible for nearly 40% of the emissions, if you can reduce those emissions significantly, you can also be a big part of the solution and problem. And from my perspective, most farmers are up for that, as long as we work with them and support them on that journey and don't expect them to do the impossible. And I think that is the space that the government is in now. And I want to give you some reassurance on that. I think you will get that reassurance on Budget Day in a couple of weeks' time. But I also think you'll get it in terms of continuous policy coming from the Minister for Agriculture and his department as well. We're on a journey here for the next number of decades to change, modernise and transform agriculture, to make it more sustainable, to maintain and grow its profitability, to do new things on our farms, like generate energy as well as food. And it's up to us in government to provide the policy platforms and financial support to make sure that it's viable to do that, and we will. We've been slow to move in that direction. I remember when I was Minister for Agriculture, we were talking about anaerobic digestion, we were talking about microgeneration on farms, we were talking about solar panels on sheds, and we should have made a lot more progress than we have by now. But I think there is an urgency in government to not only explore but to deliver the potential in those areas. But I mean, let me be honest. If we don't protect the biodiversity, the quality of our soils, if we don't protect nature as part of farming, and if we don't do what we have an obligation to do and have the capacity to do through science in terms of reducing emissions, we are essentially signing up to generational theft in terms of the quality of the farms that we'll be handing on to our kids and their children, and the contribution we'll be making to the acceleration of climate change. We can't stop it. We have to try and slow it down, is the reality. And most importantly, and I'll finish on this, the reason why I'm so opinionated and passionate about this area is that I believe that Ireland can show the way to many other countries in terms of how we can do this, which is why we need to be continuing to invest in places like UCD, in organisations like Teagasc, and many others, to ensure that we can show how you can produce beef and dairy product in a way that is climate efficient as well as profitable. And the truth is, you never get to the destination on that journey. It's a constant challenge to improve, to change, to evolve, to support. And that's what government needs to do in partnership with farming organisations and with farm families across the country. So look, I just want to commend the ASA for the quality of this conference this year. And I look forward to seeing an awful lot of you at the ploughing match in a couple of weeks' time. But more importantly, I really do look forward to the journey that agriculture will be on between now and 2030, because I'm a big believer that it can be one that is sustainable and profitable, and we can keep intact rural communities through the kind of family farm structure that has been extraordinary in terms of its benefit for rural communities in Ireland for many generations. And we have an obligation to protect that into the future, despite all of the international as well as national challenges and disruptions that we face. So thanks very much. And if you'd like me to take some questions, I'm happy to take them. Otherwise, I'll officially close the conference. Thanks very much.